Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for spending some time in your busy schedule to understand a little bit more about the potential benefits of understanding end-user performance on web-based applications. As Alex mentioned, for the purposes of clarity and to avoid any danger of music on hold and that sort of thing, we've muted your input at the moment, but there will absolutely be an opportunity to ask any questions towards the end. So please save them up and then fire them at me at the end. So, introduction, Larry Haig. I've spent many years working as an IT consultant for the last 6 or so, specifically in the area of end-user performance. And today I work with Intechnica, based in Manchester in the UK, as part of the wider performance team. So let me try to advance this presentation. Okay, so I don't know what you know of Intechnica, but in essence we have wide experience in the broader aspects of performance engineering. So that is everything from the initial approaches to development, testing, operations and so on. And as you see from this chart, there really is quite a lot to this, whether you're talking about high-level governance or specific performance monitoring. What I'm going to zero in on here, primarily for reasons of time, is specifically monitoring and specifically end-user monitoring. What I'd like to cover is some thoughts about why performance, particularly of websites, is important, what it is, why end-user monitoring of performance has particular value to you, and suggest some areas that have impact over and above that of simple response time, and then come up with some thinking about that and open it up to questions. So why does performance matter? The principal reason is because people are using the sites and people are human beings, and in this modern pressured world, customers and we all, I suspect, are not terribly patient, not as patient as we would like to be, primarily because of the other constraints of time. Given that, if they get to a perception that the performance of a particular application is poor, and I'll come to what that might mean to you, they will tend to react tactically. They will maybe abandon the site, possibly come back another day, click away to a competitor, or use collateral means. So they might go shopping in a store, bricks and mortar store, they might pick up the telephone if it's banking, whatever it may be. Either way, you are losing the benefit of your high cost effectiveness from delivery from the web as a delivery channel. Now, the first principal question to perhaps address is, what is good performance? What is customer satisfaction? Is it when people don't actually take the trouble to pick up the phone or send an email to your managing director and say, oh, I've had a bad experience? Or is it when you're better than your peers? Is it when the site performs to general norms for your sector? Whatever it is, it's important that performance is A, adequate for the purpose, not necessarily more than adequate, and that it is affordable. That building the cost of monitoring and management into the overall cost of delivery is a realistic thing to do from a business perspective. In terms of delivery, some interesting stats here around performance psychology, in that the general perception of delivery time of sites is typically somewhat slower than the actual delivery of the site. So people think a site is 10 or 15% slower than it is. If it's particularly poor and they feel impelled to share their thoughts with other people, they will tend to make it even worse still. And one of the things that in the industry we're all up against is perhaps it's never really, in absolute terms, possible to get perfection. It just isn't, and we better all appreciate that, I think. If you take Tesco, the largest grocer in Europe, and their site, I mean, they spend an awful lot of time and money and people on optimization, particularly at the front end, and their sites, are shown to be dramatically more performant, particularly at the front end, than other retailers, and yet they are getting reports, and they consistently get reports of people that say the site is slow and whatnot. So we live in that world. All you can do is try and set the things so that you're going to maximise the advantage you could get, but you're not dealing in absolutes, I think. And certainly, it's not just about your technology. It's not just about the technology, the platform you use, whatever. These things have an important part to play, of course, but at the end of the day, the delivery is the delivery, and it's really just unpicking the components of that, whether it's third parties, whether it is internal, or whether it's to do with the process and design of the site that has a bearing. So, as we all know, the trends are not favouring simplicity in this area. Sites are getting bigger, progressively bigger, particularly in retail. There are huge pressures on increasing the visual attractiveness of sites, not only in pure retail, but in anything where things are transactional, things are sold, whether it's telco, certainly media, other things. There are dramatic increases in complexity and size. So, given all of that, it's perhaps important to get some level of understanding of what's going on, rather than a series of green, amber and red lights within the data centre. Now, what should you measure? And a great quote here from Phil Dixon of Betfair: you get what you measure. And that doesn't only apply to web performance, it applies to pretty much anything, I think. And that is difficult in a web world, because it's possible to measure in many different ways. So, for example, you can measure purely from within the data center. You can measure from the links or the ramp points to the web externally. You can measure from external service providers, who could be the major tier 1 providers, or they could be tertiary providers delivering to end users. You can measure from those end users themselves, given the constraints of their equipment. So you're not talking about industrial-based stacks of testing, you're talking about ordinary PCs if you do that. And you can also test from mobile users and so forth, tablet users. So there's a lot of ways you can measure. You'll always get an answer, but it's interpretation of that answer that's important. So if you ask yourself the question, well, why bother? Why does it matter specifically to look at end user performance? Well, certainly that's the coalface. That is where the revenue is. So a few examples here. There's a few quotes around from gaming sites, from telco, recent blog that I picked up from Tom Murphy here, who's in fact alluding to some work that Google undertook. A very lightweight site, of course, and even so, they're finding that in 400 milliseconds, they're seeing direct effects on the number of searches that are successfully executed. So in the blink of an eye, this is what Tom was alluding to there, you could potentially lose customers. Now, I'm not suggesting that any given site needs to be tuned to within an inch of its life so that it delivers plus or minus, a third of a second, but it just makes the point that people's demands for performance are ever increasing. If we look at some specifics there, just a couple, there's quite a lot out there, but Shopzilla, they made some dramatic changes to the total delivery time of their pages, and I mean, from 7 to 2 seconds is of course a huge amount, but it gave them a huge amount. It gave them over 10% increase in revenue, and perhaps more importantly, it reduced their operating costs by half. Major levers there. If we look at Microsoft, at Bing in particular, they make a lot of use of monitoring technology externally around the world, and again, they were showing a direct relationship between performance and revenue. So it really is important in monetary terms. I thought you might be interested to look at some stats here, which this is collected from major retailers, from 33 if memory serves me, major retailers looking at abandonment of a key business transaction. Now this is real data, this is not synthetic monitoring data, and it's comparing performance, total load performance, against abandonment rate. And you can see the time between those 2 points, between an approximately 2.5 second total delivery time for the page to something like 7.5, 8 seconds, represented a reduction in conversion rate of some 74%. So 3/4 of their conversions were reduced by that 5-second slowdown. Really quite important. But it wouldn't be so bad if we were talking about a simple environment. We're talking about lots of different users with lots of different devices, and I'll come to that in a moment. But this perhaps is the key slide to what I wanted to mention to you, the importance of specific perspective, understanding what you're measuring and appreciating the differences. So I looked at a particular major UK retailer. I won't mention who they are, but suffice it to say they have a fairly large site and their performance is not the greatest. You're talking here, this is measuring from an average of tier 1 service providers. So it's clean room testing, it's the best possible case external testing. You're talking about industrial strength test stacks, you're talking about effectively unlimited external bandwidth coming in and targeting that home page. And you can see that the average response time was something of the order of 2.5 seconds, 2.6 seconds, which doesn't sound bad. In fact, that's not particularly fast, but it's workable. And availability 100%, so that's great news. So what is there to worry about from their perspective? Well, if we look at exactly the same homepage, tested from exactly the same test agents, but in this case not tested from the artificial test centres, ISP test centres, but tested from an average of UK-based end users, so using consumer-grade PCs, using consumer tertiary ISPs, Virgin Broadband, TalkTalk, whatever it may be, you get a very different picture. So first of all, first thing to say is look at the range of that. You're talking about delivery, forget about 2.5 seconds, the best case is about 6 seconds total load time, and the worst case is some 20 seconds. So huge amounts of variability. The average, however, was some 10 seconds, but interestingly, availability has dropped off by 9 or 10%. Now, that's equivalent to the loss of 3 weeks' revenue to that retailer if that was consistent throughout the year and for all users. I'm not suggesting it necessarily is, but in these hard times, it's important. So if we look in more depth again, rather than just looking at a general batch of end users, let's have a look by connection speed. So here the results are broken down by 3 categories. By so-called high broadband, which in our terms are available bandwidth at the time of test of over 0.5 megabit per second. Low broadband, which is more than 56 kbps and less than 0.5 meg, and 56 kbps and below. And here we see a very interesting story. So the people with the highest connectivity have got reasonably acceptable performance. 7 seconds doesn't sound great, but bear in mind this is a total load time, not a browser fill time. And the the research shows that you can get away with about 7 seconds before people start abandoning. And that's borne out. You've got about a 97% availability there. Once it gets a little bit more challenging from connection point of view, you're out to 13 or 14 seconds, 96% availability. And once you get to dial-up speeds, boy oh boy, you are losing money and damaging your brand wholesale. 27 seconds just for the landing page, 42% availability. And you may say, well, who uses dial-up these days? No one. Well, correct. Nobody uses probably a dial-up modem classically, but a heck of a lot of people will use Wi-Fi connectors, will use dongles when they're traveling, that sort of thing. There are many areas where, and I do myself, I do a lot of traveling on the trains, and 56 kbps is not unusual at all. And certainly as far as that retailer is concerned, that site would be effectively unusable. Which wouldn't be so bad, except some of their competitors, they're not unusable and they're going to make hay. So perception and understanding of where you're delivering from is very important. The other aspect before I leave this is the general quality of service. And I just thought this would be interesting just to look at the sort of errors that were being delivered to those end users. And you can see over a period, whatever this was, couple of weeks, 3 weeks or something, actually somewhat more than that, the range of types of errors. It looks like an absolute forest, and this is by no means the worst we've seen, but you're getting everything from 500 server errors, you know, server authorization access errors, through to simple timeouts and socket refusals and that kind of thing. So knowing that equals the quality of your brand to end users. Being aware of that enables you to do something about it. As I alluded to earlier, who are your customers? Well, wouldn't life be great if they were just one simple type of user using one simple type of device? But as we've already seen, that is very far from being the case. We work today, as we all know, in a world of complexity where the number of devices, the number every month that goes by, you're having to support older versions of the same things, new devices being brought out. It really is quite something to find your way through. And that affects the performance that people get. And that's another important takeaway. Understand performance to whatever your users are using. Don't assume it will all be the same. And just again, some illustrations here. Now there's some stats. It's somewhat old, this one, a couple of years old, but it was collecting from 160 million pages. These are in the US, in fact, and comparing performance for thousands of sites, different sites, not just one customer, the performance to different versions of the then key browsers. So what as you see, I mean, IE6 is mentioned here, still quite prominent, surprisingly. Certainly if you're talking about international operations, China, it's the largest single browser version in China, but also I was speaking to a local authority in Scotland last week. They are still standardized on IE6. And you can see the huge differences there in delivery performance. Just to stand out with two, if you look at IE7, raw performance, again, as I say, many hundreds of sites, this is generalized performance, 10.2 seconds total delivery time of a page, whereas Safari, regardless of version, 2.3 seconds for the same pages. So vast differences in performance. So understanding who your customers are, what they're using, and therefore understanding testing from that is important. If we look at slightly more recent data, all that really says is it's still borne out, whether you're talking about Chrome, whether you're talking about IE9, whatever. So we've looked at performance, we've looked at end user performance, and we've considered the effect of connection speed and to some extent browser and device. There are certainly some other things which I just wanted to allude to which bear on revenue. from delivery of transactional sites. So I thought these two pictures rather well encapsulated it. Which type of store would you prefer to shop in, the one on the left or the one on the right? If we look at some aspects of that. So consistency. This was just one that came to hand, a trace that came to hand. It's not necessarily the best example that I've ever seen, but here we have a bank, in fact a Scottish bank, and you're looking at a clean room backbone test result for the landing page over time. And you can see this classic sine wave effect. There are, in fact, in this one, several things going on. You can see the general trend here becomes slow and then quick again. So there's probably some kind of underlying memory leakage or something going on there. But the core thing is, when the site gets busy, it gets slow, and when it gets quiet, it gets quick again. So, and the take-home message for this particular company is they can deliver at 800 milliseconds, because they do. But they're also delivering at 2 seconds. What are the differences? What's causing it to be 2 seconds when it could be 0.8 of a second, and what can be done about that? And there certainly are things that can be. So the research, it's a little bit sparse, but it's interesting in that it says that people's ability or propensity to abandon sites is partially conditioned by their expectation of the site. So if they normally go to Google and they find it to be blindingly fast, which absolutely it should be, as we've said, there's not much on there, and then they find it to be slow, that will have a negative effect. If they go to another site, particularly if it's something where it's difficult to find elsewhere or whatever it may be, and it's clearly working, but it's somewhat slow and ponderous, but if it's consistent, people will hang in there. If it's a pure commodity item, if it's hyper-competitive, then maybe they won't. But generally, good consistency is not as important, but is certainly a good second-order level of importance to performance itself. Brand perception. So partly it's performance, but partly do you just want to get to a nightmare quicker? Clearly you don't. If you walk into a bricks and mortar store and it's dirty and the over aisle signage is hanging off and the store staff are slovenly and so on, or the store next door where everything's pin sharp, well, which would you prefer to use? I know which I would. Now, certainly understanding performance from a visual perspective, so not from a time of seconds, but from a visual appearance across different devices is, in our view, is very important, and also can have direct as well as indirect effects. So here's one from Harry Potter. As you can see, the same page, compared on the left, they're superimposed, but compared on the left in Microsoft Internet Explorer 7 on Vista, and on the right in Firefox, you can see that in this particular case, the image, which was had a direct revenue impact clearly to them, to the Pottermore stuff, was missing. Again, links. The most important to look so that if you have links, whether they're to third parties or whether they're to components of elsewhere in your site, that they work. There's very little that's more frustrating to find a link, clicking on it, and it's either very poor in performance or it doesn't work at all. And certainly there are many tools out there to do that. Our view is use one of them. Doesn't matter which it is particularly, but if you can take a holistic view, then that's quite important. This particular example is from a major supermarket, and you can see they would get, on that particular day, they were being let down, particularly with a couple of their third-party sites. Getting through this now, but another point that I didn't want to leave without mentioning is you're no longer typically in control of the whole of your delivery chain. There are many third parties involved in delivery of a site. So here we have a few. This just gives you an example. It is retail, but of course there are many different flavours of retail, and so you may argue with the proportions, but certainly many sites today have got analytics, and we certainly think that's a good idea. Advertising links important, means of accelerating the site, so content delivery networks and that kind of thing. Just to take that as a simple example, if you've got a content delivery site, and I'll be particularly alluding to this in a later presentation in the series, important to measure it. And in our view, the only way of effectively measuring that is from the end user in the markets to which you're considering that are important to you from a revenue point of view. So here we have two traces. One's looking at the site directly from the origin, another's looking at the locally cached performance, and you can see that the particular CDN in this case is delivering quite well. It's halving the delivery time in that key market. But having monitored it, you're clearly paying for the difference between those two lines. And here we see, to the extent that they come close to one another, that you've got about an hour when you're spending handsomely with your CDN, but it's not delivering much value to you. So understanding that and delivering to it. I must apologise for the noises off, if you can hear this. There is a public area outside this presentation room in which there is a small child who is competing with my presentation. So if you can hear that, I apologise. So we looked at third parties. Again, there's a longer conversation we could have there, but time is short. And the other thing is to say that, as I mentioned before, we're not talking about absolutes here. We're living in the real world, and everything is relative. So if we look here at a benchmark performance across different retailers, they've been selected on the basis of traffic rather than type of retailer. And if you look at a couple here, quite good examples, two retailers that are ticket sellers. So they're very similar in what they do, but boy oh boy do they have different performance. So all things being equal, you're talking about something over double the load time for Ticketmaster, or it was in that month anyway, to see tickets. That cannot but have a negative effect. And given that these things are measurable, manageable and resolvable, then why have a site that's compromised? Deal with the difficult things. These are they're complex, but they're relatively straightforward to sort out if you know what you're looking for and if you can advise accordingly. So where are we trying to get to? Can any difference be made? Well, absolutely. I mean, if you look at ASOS as a good example, Intechnica has worked with ASOS for a number of years, and certainly they've made great strides. If you look at that as a trend performance, this is to their UK ASOS.com landing page, and again it's looking at cleanroom performance. This isn't end user performance in this case. That is important, but if you're looking at trending, it's better to use cleanroom data, and you can see strong, consistent improvement in the context of a highly competitive sector, of a highly competitive market, where the demands for richness and heavy imagery and so on are unceasing. So you can do something about it. That's the bottom line. So as we move towards the close, and you've been very patient, and I will give you the opportunity to ask some questions in just a moment, but I thought it was sensible to net this out in terms of a few recommendations, certainly in our view, and you might challenge them. But the first would be to understand what normality is for your site. In other words, to baseline the site. Baseline it from a number of perspectives, but certainly understand what normality is. That enables you to then make judgments about where you're going to get to going forward. Anticipate the trends in your customers. So you can't do anything about them directly, in that you can't stop the trends, but if you understand the trends, and that is talking to sector experts such as Intechnica, looking at the data out there on the web from the major statistical providers, and looking at things like your web analytics data. You will be able to see and monitor what's happening out there in the customer base. Stay close to the revenue, so stay close to the end user. That's a key point. It's not the whole story, and certainly it's important to be able to compare backbone and end user performance in order to get the best resolution. But and some sort of end user understanding is important. Measure all the components of the delivery chain. Certainly the ones that are in your immediate control, but also the ones that are not. So the third-party components, the acceleration, the analytics, the click-through advertising, whatever it may be, the A/B testing. If it's there, if it's on the site, if it's being delivered to your end users, you better understand the impact that that's having, for good or for ill. In terms of your customers, serve the key customer groups. There are probably going to be people coming to your site from any number of peculiar, ancient or modern browsers and devices. If they're a few fractions of a percent, you're never going to get to everything. So keep an eye on them, make sure they're not growing, but they're not going to drive your decisions and your investment. But however, the key customer groups, regardless of what the big browser versions are today, that is not necessarily going to drive what people are using on your site. If you find you've got a big heavy usage of IE6 or IE7 or whatever it may be, then they're the people you need to serve today, regardless of the fact that Microsoft and the general bandwagon has moved on. If you do those things, you're enabled to set iterative goals. So it's not saying we want to get from a ticket master, you need a calendar to measure this load time, to Tesco 1.5 seconds overnight. Clearly not. But if you understand where you are, if you understand where you are relative to your key competitors or to sites that your customers are visiting when they're not visiting your site, whether they're retailers or otherwise, then you can set yourself some manageable goals and seek to achieve them for commercial success. And the final point I would make is that performance is a holistic activity. It is not only about technicians. It is not only about monitoring. It's about the line of business. It's about your strategy and the operations, how you take that strategy into the market, as well as the customers and everything, and your competitors. But if you view it as a holistic activity, and you give all the relative people in the organization the ability to view some of that understanding, whether they're in marketing, whether they're in quality assurance, whether they're in operations or IT dev, or whether they're C-level, they won't all want to see the same things, but to give them some view of what's going on is certainly generally a healthy thing in our view. So that was essentially, within the constraints of the time we had, what I wanted to say. A final word on Intechnica. We do cover the waterfront as far as performance monitoring is concerned. It is our key area of competence, whether it's understanding and auditing where a company is starting from in terms of the procedures they use, whether it's looking at end user performance and competitiveness, or whether it's getting more down into the weeds and understanding the engineering and delivery and design aspects. I would commend you to the Art of Performance Engineering. This is available in all good bookshops. It was written by Molyneux, who's our head of performance, so in essence he's my boss. But that does give you a good sense of it if you have time, or do contact us. We'd be delighted to talk to you. And bear in mind, the final thought, that performance is a holistic activity. If you can give yourself the view across the whole of performance applications, whether it's end user, allied to revenue directly, allied to internal performance, then you've got the best chance of maximising the performance for your organisation. So thank you very much for your patience. Can I ask Alex to open things up so that we can take any questions?
Okay, I've sort of been encouraging people to type them up for me and send them through to the text. So
okay.
If you have any in mind, we can just jot them down. So do you have any recommendations for the best tools in the market for end user offering?
Then I do, but whether I would want to necessarily shoot from the hip on that, I think our contention would be, and certainly mine would be, there isn't a right tool for a given customer. It depends. It depends on you. It depends on the nature of your site and what you're trying to achieve from a business perspective. Once we understand that and can capture that as a central reference document, we can certainly then make recommendations as to which of the tools, and there are really many, many out there, would give you the best holistic approach. Because the other aspect of that is, our view is you should seek to minimise the number of vendors that you've got delivering this understanding for a number of reasons, but certainly for simplicity and comparability. If you can find what you want to do first, agree that, and then we would make appropriate recommendations.
Okay, got another one sort of about what they're trying to say is you use a lot of retail examples, but what about the application of monitoring for other verticals?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for that. The reason I use retail is primarily, well, partly because I have a lot of experience in that area, but partly because that is absolutely where the rubber hits the road in terms of direct revenue. These are the major direct revenue delivery sites. So they tend to be at the leading edge of practice in this area. But certainly the recommendations apply equally, regardless of sector. Whether you're talking about banking and finance, where some of the key aspects are reducing other overheads in the business. So they're reducing pressure on the collateral calls to the telephone call centre and things like that, rather than necessarily gaining revenue directly, although that is changing, certainly in the insurance markets. Most of these principles apply equally to intranet applications. If you're talking, we've dealt with some major companies where their management information is handled by delivery across the intranet, and there, although the criteria for performance are different in that the measure of value is different, the principles apply absolutely.
Okay, good. So for someone who's not doing any monitoring at the moment, someone wants to know, what's the best place to start? What do we need to find out to get started with something like this?
Okay, so it sounds glib, but I would say speak to us initially, and we can understand what's relevant from an investment point of view as well as everything else. But I would say start with a good general understanding. So work with people that know what they're doing. Start by specifying what you need to do, and you can certainly work with us to do that on the basis of best practice, on the basis of what other people in your sector, whatever that is, are. To define what you need to achieve, who needs to see the results of that, and then from that we could work our way in on a progressive approach to baselining, as I mentioned, and then understanding the components of performance, and then progressively focusing on, first of all, dealing with the major issues that are impacting you, and then gradually working down towards the second order issues.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Okay. Someone here says they work for a global telecoms business. Actually, do you have any experience with telecoms?
Some, limited. I used to work for a major performance vendor, and I worked in the same team as people who had specific telco experience. For a short period I was part of that team, so I do have some experience, but I wouldn't regard myself as a telco expert. However, as I mentioned, the basic principles of performance to end users are cross-sector, in my view.